Snow fell like shattered glass that night. In the far mountains of the American South, where even the wind seemed afraid to speak, one man lived alone, a ghost among trees. His name was Ethan Cole, a former K-9 soldier who'd lost everything in a war that never really ended. Inside his cabin, silence was his punishment. Every creak of wood, every breath of wind reminded him of the partner he couldn't save. A German shepherd named Rex, who died protecting him. Ethan hadn't spoken to another soul in months. He didn't need to. The world was better off without him. But that night, as the storm clawed at his roof and the fire hissed low, Ethan heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the wind. A howl, distant but alive. He stood, rifle in hand, heart pounding. It couldn't be. Not after all these years. Yet something deep inside him stirred. Something that hadn't moved since the war. It was the kind of sound that changes everything. And before dawn came, Ethan would open his door and meet the soul that would save him. The wind moved through the mountains like a living thing, low and mournful, carrying with it the sighs of forgotten winters. Snow draped across the southern peaks of the American wilderness, untouched, unbroken, and endless. In that silence, far from any town or trace of humankind, a small cabin stood against the white expanse, its roof heavy with ice, its chimney breathing faint smoke into the colorless sky. Inside that cabin lived Ethan Cole, a man who had once led soldiers and canines into enemy fire, but who now led only himself into the kind of stillness that could kill a weaker soul. The war had ended for everyone else. For him, it hadn't. Every morning, Ethan woke before dawn, the same way he used to in the desert. Habit, not purpose. He'd rise to the groan of the old wood stove, his breath visible in the freezing air. He would make black coffee, never sugar, never cream. Then he'd step out into the cold that bit at his skin like a reprimand. The axe in his hand struck wood with rhythmic precision. Each swing echoed through the valley, bouncing off the frozen trees like a heartbeat. He liked that sound, the clean, sharp certainty of impact. Out here, there were no orders, no radio chatter, no screaming. Only the wind, the snow, and the thud of his own survival. The cabin had once belonged to his father, a park ranger who'd spent his life protecting this mountain. After his death, the place had been left empty until Ethan came back, dragging ghosts behind him. He was 36 now, tall and built like a man who'd learned to endure. His beard had gone uneven, streaked with gray, and his eyes, once the clear blue of open sky, had dulled to storm clouds. In another life, he'd been the calm voice on the comms, the one who could read danger in the wind. Now he barely spoke at all. Some nights he would write letters by the glow of an oil lamp, letters to names etched on gravestones: Sergeant Davis, Corporal Hernandez, Rex. The words were neat, deliberate, and never sent. "We made it home," he'd write, "but home doesn't know what to do with me." Then he'd fold the paper, stare at it for a long moment, and feed it to the fire. The flames always seemed hungrier than he remembered. Rex. The name alone could tear open the quiet. He saw it sometimes in his sleep. The convoy trapped in an ambush, the sandstorm blurring the horizon, the frantic bark that cut through gunfire. Rex had leapt toward the explosion before Ethan could call him back. A blast, a scream, then nothing but ringing silence. When he'd awoken in the medic tent, bandaged and broken, the cot beside him had been empty. A handler without his dog, a soldier without his reason. That was the day he stopped hearing music in the world. Now, each dawn was a ritual of penance. He'd walk the perimeter of the clearing, checking traps, scanning for wolf tracks or bear prints, not because he feared them, because they reminded him that something still lived here. At noon, he'd sit on the porch steps with a canteen of water and a view that stretched forever. He would stare at that horizon until his mind drifted into memories he couldn't escape. He remembered Rex's weight pressing against his leg before every patrol, the subtle communication between them. No words, no gestures, just trust. In those days, loyalty had meant something absolute. Now it was just a word written on metals he never looked at. The snow began to fall heavier that afternoon. Flakes drifted like ash through the gray sky, soft and soundless. Ethan pulled his coat tighter, the old military one with torn cuffs, and carried the chopped wood inside. The fire roared to life, painting the room in orange and gold. Shadows danced across the wooden walls, and for a brief moment, it felt like company. He ate simply, beans, jerky, coffee, and watched the flames as if they could tell him what to do next. But there was no next. There hadn't been for years. He wasn't waiting for anyone to find him. He was waiting for time to forget he existed. Outside, the wind picked up, slamming snow against the cabin windows in long, hollow gusts. He didn't mind storms. Storms were honest. They told you exactly how bad they were. People didn't. By nightfall, the sky had become a churning mass of gray and white. The mountain roared with the sound of the coming blizzard. Ethan checked the door latch, made sure the woodpile was covered, and sat again by the fire. The old radio on the shelf crackled faintly, picking up static from somewhere hundreds of miles away. He reached for his father's worn journal, entries about forest fires, wildlife, and weather patterns. But halfway through reading, his eyes glazed over. His thoughts drifted again. Always, they circled back to Rex. "You'd have hated this cold," he murmured, setting the journal down. "You were a desert dog." The words felt heavy, pointless, but they filled the space. He leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes, letting the wind outside hum its ghostly tune. The silence was perfect. Too perfect. That was when he heard it. Distant, faint, threading through the howl of the storm. A sound that didn't belong to wind or timber or the moan of the mountain. It was a howl, not a wolf's, not wild. Something sharper, more desperate, alive with purpose. Ethan's eyes snapped open. He sat motionless, listening. For a long moment, there was nothing but the pounding of the storm against the roof. Then it came again, faint, mournful, almost pleading. His pulse quickened, a strange mixture of dread and recognition swelling in his chest. He stood, every sense awakening as if the soldier inside him had never left. He moved to the frosted window, staring into the swirling white outside. Nothing. Only the relentless curtain of snow. But the sound lingered in his ears, echoing through the valley. A howl that reached across miles of emptiness. A call that pierced the silence he'd built around himself like armor. He stepped back from the window, the firelight catching in his eyes. For the first time in years, they didn't look dead. They looked uncertain, alive. Outside, the wind wailed again, carrying that haunting sound farther into the night. Ethan whispered to the empty room, as though to the ghosts that watched over him. "Rex?" The storm answered with another long, lonely cry. The first echo of something he didn't yet understand, but that would soon change everything. The storm had grown cruel. Snow drove sideways against the cabin walls, hammering them like fists of ice. The night outside was a white blur, wind screaming through the pines, the world erased beneath an endless ocean of frost. Inside, the fire hissed and cracked, the only heartbeat in a house that had forgotten the sound of laughter. Ethan sat in the wooden chair near the hearth, a wool blanket draped over his shoulders. The orange glow of the flames drew sharp lines across his face, making the hollows beneath his eyes look deeper. He had been awake for hours, listening to the fury outside. Storms like this could swallow a man whole. He'd seen it happen, nature's quiet way of claiming the lonely. Somewhere deep in the white wilderness, wolves would be curling into their dens. Nothing alive moved on nights like this. Except, there it was again. A faint sound. At first Ethan thought it was just the wind twisting through the trees, scraping a loose branch against the roof. But then it came again. Faint, uneven, almost rhythmic. A scratch. He froze, his hand still on the mug of coffee halfway to his lips. Scratch. Scratch. Then a pause. A low, broken whine carried on the wind. Ethan set the mug down slowly, eyes narrowing. No, he murmured under his breath, half to the storm, half to himself. Not out here. No animal would come this high in a blizzard, not unless it was desperate or dying. He rose, every muscle tightening beneath his flannel and jacket. Years of training came alive beneath his skin, the soldier reawakening from hibernation. He moved quietly to the door, listening. The storm roared, trying to drown everything out, but he heard it again. A dragging sound, weak and deliberate. Something was out there, trying to reach him. He hesitated. Memories clawed up from the dark corners of his mind. The battlefield, the dust, the echo of his partner's bark before the blast. His hand trembled as it hovered above the door latch. He almost didn't open it. But that sound, so faint, so human in its pleading, cut through the fear. Ethan lifted the latch and pulled. The door slammed open under the force of the wind, blasting him with a wall of snow and cold so sharp it stole his breath. He staggered against it, squinting into the blinding white. The lantern by the window flickered, struggling to stay alive. At his feet, half buried in a drift, lay a shape, large, still. A dog. Ethan's heart stopped. For a moment he thought his mind was playing another cruel trick, like the nightmares that sometimes clawed him awake at night. But this wasn't a dream. The creature was real, its thick coat matted with snow and streaked with blood, its sides heaving faintly as it fought for each breath. He dropped to his knees. "Hey," he whispered, his voice hoarse, trembling. "Hey, easy there." He brushed the snow from its muzzle, revealing the strong lines of a German shepherd's face. Frost clung to its whiskers, and blood had frozen around a wound on its flank. Around its neck was a military-grade tracking collar, cracked, wires exposed, the metal engraved with numbers he didn't recognize. And then the dog opened its eyes. Amber. Deep. Intelligent. The same color he remembered. For a heartbeat, time folded in on itself. The cabin vanished, the cold, the snow, all gone. Ethan was back in the desert, dust stinging his eyes, the air split by gunfire. A bark, short, sharp, brave, and then the explosion that changed everything. "Rex," he breathed. The name left his lips before he could stop it. The dog blinked slowly, barely conscious, but something in those eyes, some echo of loyalty and pain, made his throat tighten. "Jesus Christ," Ethan muttered, shaking his head as if to break the spell. "Not Rex. Not this time." He slid his arms beneath the dog, feeling the dead weight of a body too cold, too weak. Its fur was stiff with ice, its heart barely fluttering against his chest. "Come on, soldier," he said, his voice steadier now. "You're not dying out here. Not tonight." He kicked the door shut with his boot and stumbled back toward the fire. The warmth hit them both like a wave. Ethan laid the dog gently on an old wool rug, close enough to feel the heat, but not so close it would shock his system. The soldier in him took command. He moved fast, grabbed towels, the first aid kit, a canteen of warm combustion water. He checked the pulse, weak, but there. The breath, shallow, but steady. The wound, deep, jagged, more like a knife than an animal's bite. "Someone did this to you," he murmured. The anger in his chest surprised him. Quiet, sharp, familiar. He worked carefully, washing the blood, trimming the fur around the wound, cleaning with iodine. The dog didn't move, only flinched once when the antiseptic burned. Ethan whispered to him, low and steady, like he used to talk to Rex in the field. "Easy, buddy. You're home. You made it." Outside, the storm howled, furious and wild, but inside, the world shrank to the steady rhythm of Ethan's breathing and the fragile rise and fall of the dog's chest. Minutes stretched into an hour. The fire crackled louder, its glow climbing up the walls. Ethan wrapped the dog in a thick blanket, pressing his palm to its ribcage, feeling for warmth. "You're gonna make it," he said softly. "You hear me? You're gonna damn well make it." He remembered saying those same words once before, to Rex, lying in the dirt, his body broken, his eyes still searching for command. Back then, the words hadn't been enough. Maybe tonight, they could be. Ethan's breath came slow and heavy. He didn't realize the tears had started until one slipped down his cheek and landed on the dog's fur, darkening it. He wiped his face roughly, almost angry at himself. The firelight shimmered, painting the room in gold and red. The dog stirred. A faint sound, a sigh almost, escaped its throat. Its paw twitched against the blanket. Ethan froze. "Come on," he whispered. "Come on, soldier." The dog's chest rose again, then again, stronger this time. A tremor ran through its body, followed by a shuddering breath. It was alive. Ethan sat back on his heels, staring in disbelief. Relief surged through him so sudden, it left him dizzy. He let out a shaky laugh, the first real sound of emotion that had passed his lips in years. "Welcome back," he said quietly, his voice breaking. "You're safe now." Outside, the storm still raged, tearing through the wilderness. But in that small cabin, something profound had shifted. For years, Ethan had lived surrounded by silence, chasing ghosts, waiting for nothing. Now, on a night meant for death, something had found him. Something that breathed, bled, and reminded him what it meant to care again. He leaned back, eyes fixed on the fire, his hand resting gently on the dog's side. The storm could have the mountain. The night could have its fury. Inside that cabin, life had returned. And for the first time in years, Ethan Cole was not alone. Morning came slow and gray over the frozen ridges. The storm had spent itself during the night, leaving behind a silence so pure it almost rang. The snow outside lay untouched, gleaming beneath a sky the color of steel. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low but steady, a faint orange heartbeat against the cold. Ethan stirred awake in his chair, stiff from having slept upright. The blanket that had once wrapped around him now lay draped over the body at his feet, the German shepherd he'd dragged from death's edge. For a moment, Ethan sat still, uncertain if the rise and fall beneath the blanket was real or imagined. Then the dog exhaled, a slow, steady breath that clouded the air. Alive. Ethan released a sigh he hadn't known he was holding. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, staring at the creature that had appeared from the storm, as if summoned by his ghosts. The dog's fur, once stiff with ice and blood, was now softening as the warmth worked through it. The wound on his flank, freshly dressed, showed faint signs of healing. "Guess you're tougher than you look," Ethan murmured. His voice was hoarse from days of disuse. The dog stirred but didn't wake. Ethan moved quietly through the cabin, rekindling the fire and setting a small pot of broth on the stove. The familiar motions steadied him. He'd spent so long moving through the days without purpose, chopping wood, cleaning traps, repeating meaningless routines. Now each step had direction. Each breath had reason. When the broth was ready, he poured it into a small bowl and set it beside the sleeping animal. "Wake up, soldier," he said softly. "You've got orders." The words slipped out before he could stop them. They sounded foreign in the quiet, yet strangely right. The dog stirred again, this time opening his eyes. The amber gaze was glassy with exhaustion, but alert, full of something human in its depth. Ethan crouched, keeping his movements slow. "Hey, easy," he whispered. "You're safe here." The dog lifted his head weakly, nose twitching, as the scent of the broth reached him. Ethan pushed the bowl closer, but the shepherd didn't move. His ears tilted back, not in aggression, but in the wary hesitation of an animal that had learned pain too well. Ethan saw it immediately, the subtle flinch, the tremor in his forelegs, the way he braced as if expecting a blow. His chest tightened. He'd seen that reaction before, in the eyes of rescued captives overseas. Men who had forgotten what gentle meant. "It's all right," he said softly, his tone the same one he used to calm terrified civilians during raids. "Nobody's gonna hurt you." He dipped his fingers into the bowl, lifted them to the dog's muzzle, and let a few drops fall onto the cold, black nose. The shepherd's tongue flicked out, cautious, tasting. A moment later, he licked Ethan's fingers. "There you go," Ethan said, smiling faintly. "Not so bad, huh?" Slowly, the dog pushed himself upright. He leaned forward and began to lap from the bowl, his movements careful and shaky but determined. Ethan stayed where he was, unmoving, letting the animal set the pace. When the last drop was gone, the shepherd looked up, eyes meeting his. There was something in that gaze, something that stirred memories Ethan had buried under years of silence. He exhaled slowly. "I guess we both made it out of somewhere we shouldn't have." The dog tilted his head, as if listening. For a heartbeat, Ethan imagined he understood every word. That day passed in fragments of warmth and quiet. Ethan tended to the dog's wounds, speaking to him as he worked, part habit, part therapy. He told stories he hadn't told anyone. About the base, the desert heat, the sound of rotors beating overhead. About Rex, who'd never left his side until that last moment. "You'd have liked him," he said once, washing dried blood from the dog's paws. "He was stubborn. Thought he could take on the whole damn world. Guess he wasn't wrong." The dog's tail thumped once against the rug, a soft, hesitant sound, but it drew a laugh from Ethan that surprised even him. He decided to name him Shadow. It felt right. The way the dog moved, quiet, watchful, always close but never intrusive, fit the name perfectly. "You follow me like you've done this before," Ethan said as he cleaned up the medical kit. "Shadow it is, then." By evening, the wind outside had calmed to a whisper. The sky through the frosted window burned with the pale orange of sunset, casting long streaks of gold across the cabin floor. Ethan sat near the fire, a worn paperback in hand, though he wasn't reading. Shadow lay nearby, his head resting on Ethan's boot. His body stretched toward the warmth. Every few minutes, Ethan's hand drifted down to the dog's neck, fingers brushing against the broken collar. The serial number was worn, half illegible. Whoever had owned Shadow before had marked him like property, but the animal's eyes spoke of something deeper, something that had survived cruelty. "You've seen some bad days," Ethan murmured. "So have I." The shepherd lifted his head, blinking up at him. The look in those eyes was almost understanding. Ethan smiled faintly, shaking his head. "You know, if you keep that up, I'm going to start talking to you like a person." Shadow's tail moved once, just once, and Ethan laughed again, softly. The fire popped, sending sparks swirling upward like fireflies. Outside, the snow reflected the last light of the sun, an endless white stretching beyond the glass. For the first time since coming to this mountain, Ethan didn't feel the need to look past the horizon. Everything that mattered was right here. That night, when the fire had died to embers and the wind sighed low through the chimney, Ethan dozed lightly in his chair. Shadow slept curled near the hearth, breathing deep and even. Then, suddenly, a low sound broke the quiet. A whimper. Ethan's eyes snapped open. He saw Shadow's paws twitching, claws scraping softly against the rug. The dog's body jerked, muscles tightening as if he were running or fighting something only he could see. Whines deepened into short, desperate yelps. His breathing grew, fast, panicked. Ethan was beside him in an instant, dropping to his knees. Hey, it's okay," he said, his voice low, steady. He reached out, letting his hand rest gently on the dog's shoulder. "You're safe, Shadow. It's over." The shepherd's legs kicked once more, then stilled beneath Ethan's palm. His breath slowed. A long shudder ran through him before he exhaled deeply, the tremor fading. Ethan stayed there for a long moment, his hand never moving. The firelight caught the faint glisten of moisture in his eyes. He knew that kind of dream, the kind that tore you open from the inside, the kind that didn't stop when you woke. "It's over, boy," he whispered again, his voice breaking. "You're home now." The dog shifted slightly, pressing his head against Ethan's knee. And in that small cabin, two souls, one scarred by war, one by cruelty, breathed the same slow rhythm. Outside, the night deepened, quiet and merciful. Inside, beside the fire, something that neither of them had dared hope for began to take root. Not just survival, healing. By the fourth day, the storm had retreated into memory. The mountains gleamed under the weak afternoon sun, the snow dazzling and mercilessly bright. A fragile peace had settled over the cabin, a stillness Ethan hadn't known in years. Inside, the fire burned low, sending up faint wisps of smoke that curled lazily toward the rafters. Ethan sat at the rough wooden table, mending one of his old flannel shirts by hand, the rhythmic pull of the thread soothing in its simplicity. Shadow lay nearby, curled into a crescent shape near the window. The German shepherd had grown stronger with each day. His coat had regained its luster, his eyes clearer now, alert and intelligent. He ate heartily, drank well, and even began to follow Ethan around the cabin with quiet devotion. But something had changed. Ethan noticed it first in the way Shadow watched the world outside. The dog would lift his head, ears pricking, gaze locked on the distant tree line beyond the clearing. Sometimes he would stand for long stretches, his breath fogging the glass, the rest of him utterly still, as if listening to something just beyond human hearing. At first, Ethan dismissed it. Old habits, maybe. Dogs like Shadow, especially ones trained for the field, were hardwired to stay alert. Even now, he sometimes caught himself scanning the ridges for movement, though there was nothing out there but snow and silence. But Shadow's focus wasn't casual. It was absolute. By the fifth afternoon, Ethan couldn't ignore it anymore. He was stacking firewood when he noticed the dog again, standing rigid at the window, his tail low, ears pointed forward, eyes locked on a single direction. Not the horizon, not the road. a specific point deep within the forest, where the sun slipped behind the pines and the light turned a pale, golden gray. Ethan wiped his hands on his jeans and approached. "What do you see, out there?" he asked quietly. Shadow didn't move, didn't blink. The only sign of life was the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing, fogging the window pane. Ethan followed the line of the dog's gaze, squinting past the glare of the snow. The world outside was postcard perfect, still, blindingly white, framed by the dark silhouettes of pine trees. Nothing stirred, and yet, something in the stillness made his skin prickle. "You're wound tight, huh?" Ethan murmured. "Storm's over. Nothing's out there." But the dog didn't react. His muscles were tense beneath his coat, the fur along his shoulders standing slightly on end. Ethan felt that familiar tug deep in his gut, the same instinct that had saved his life more than once overseas. It was a strange thing, intuition. It didn't speak in words, only in weight, in the way the air seemed to thicken, the way time slowed for no reason at all. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to shake it off. "Relax," he said, giving the dog a pat on the neck. "You've got food, fire, and 4 solid walls. That's more than most." But even as he turned away, Shadow moved. The shepherd rose, padded across the room, and sat directly in front of the cabin door. He didn't look at Ethan. He just stared at the wood, ears forward, tail lying flat against the floorboards. Then came the sound, a soft, low whine that seemed to vibrate from deep in his chest. Not a cry of fear, not even impatience. It was pleading. Ethan frowned. "What's with you?" Shadow's paw lifted, pressed once against the door. Then again. A scratch, delicate but deliberate. Ethan's chest tightened. He tried to brush it off with a humorless chuckle. "You want to walk? In this?" He gestured toward the frozen world outside. "You must have hit your head harder than I thought." Still, the dog didn't move. Hours passed that way. Every time Ethan looked up, Shadow was there, by the door or the window, always facing the same direction. When Ethan tried to distract him with food or a command, the shepherd responded politely, but returned to his vigil the moment Ethan turned away. By evening, the peace inside the cabin had shifted. Something unseen had crept in with the fading light, a tension that sat between them, heavy and unspoken. Ethan sat by the fire, book in hand, though his eyes hadn't moved past the same line in 20 minutes. The crackle of burning wood filled the silence, punctuated now and then by the faint sound of Shadow's claws against the floor. Finally, Ethan snapped the book shut. "All right," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Out with it." Shadow turned his head, meeting his eyes. "What's out there, huh? A deer? A bear? Or maybe ghosts? Because I've got enough of those already." The shepherd's ears twitched at his voice, but the eyes, those bright amber eyes, remained fixed, intense, unwavering. Ethan rubbed a hand over his face. He'd told himself 1,000 times that the war had trained him to see threats everywhere. That solitude was the only thing that kept him sane. But watching the dog now, he felt something stir, something that had nothing to do with fear. It was connection. It was instinct. And it terrified him. The wind outside began to rise again, whispering through the cracks in the walls. The light was fading fast. Dusk crept through the forest, painting the snow in shades of violet and gold. Ethan rose slowly from his chair. Shadow stood too. For a moment, man and dog mirrored each other, 2 silhouettes against the flickering firelight, both staring at the same unseen point beyond the glass. Then, Without warning, Shadow let out a sound that froze the air in Ethan's lungs. A howl. It wasn't loud, but it was long and low, vibrating through the cabin like a string pulled too tight. It carried pain, memory, and something Ethan couldn't name, something that made the hairs rise on the back of his neck. Shadow's head tilted back slightly, his chest expanding as if he were trying to call something home or mourn something lost. Ethan swallowed hard, his hands curled into fists at his sides. "That's not fear," he whispered. "That's a message." Shadow's howl faded into silence, swallowed by the winter air. The dog turned his gaze back to Ethan, eyes glimmering with a strange, haunted purpose. The veteran stepped closer, his heart pounding, the soldier inside him stirring like an old ghost. He crouched beside the shepherd, voice barely above a breath. "Who's out there, boy?" The wind hissed softly against the door, carrying with it the faintest echo of something distant, something that might have been another howl, or might have been the forest itself answering back. Ethan's pulse quickened. He looked toward the window one last time, his reflection flickering against the glass. Behind it, the forest loomed silent and endless, its shadows deepening with the fall of night. The peace he'd found here, the fragile, trembling kind, was gone. Something out there was calling, and Shadow had heard it first. Morning rose cold and blinding over the mountains. The blizzard had spent its rage through the night, leaving behind a silence that felt almost sacred. The snow stretched in every direction, smooth, untouched, gleaming beneath a sun pale as bone. It was the kind of stillness that could fool a man into thinking the world had stopped turning. Ethan Cole stood at the window of the cabin, staring out at the vast white wilderness. His breath fogged the glass. Behind him, the fire had burned down to glowing coals, but he didn't move to stoke it. His mind was elsewhere, still replaying the haunting sound from last night. Shadow's howl. It hadn't been random. It hadn't been animal. There had been intention in it. Something sharp and aching that went deeper than instinct. And afterward, when Ethan had looked into those amber eyes, he'd seen no fear, no confusion, only certainty. The dog knew something. Now, in the crystalline light of dawn, Shadow sat by the cabin door again, alert and waiting. His posture was calm but resolute. When Ethan turned toward him, the dog's ears perked, tail giving a single, restrained wag. "You really want to go out there?" Ethan said quietly. Shadow didn't blink. Ethan sighed, rubbing a hand across the back of his neck. The soldier in him bristled. Logic said it was foolish, leaving shelter in this weather to chase a feeling, a directionless instinct. But there was another voice inside him, the one that had always kept him alive when logic would have gotten him killed. Trust your gut. Trust your partner. He stared at the dog for a long moment before giving a small nod. "All right, soldier," he muttered. "Show me." Within minutes, the cabin came alive with motion. Ethan pulled on his heavy coat and layered a thick flannel beneath it. He filled his rucksack with the essentials: rations, water, a compact first aid kit, extra gloves, and matches sealed in wax paper. From the gun rack, he took down his rifle, a Remington his father had once used for elk. The metal was cold against his palms, but the weight was reassuring. Shadow watched him the entire time, tail swishing once with every movement, as though understanding the ritual. When Ethan finally opened the door, the cold hit him like a slap. The air was razor sharp, biting at his skin. Snow glittered like glass in the morning light. For a moment, he hesitated on the threshold, staring out into the endless white. "God help us both," he murmured, then stepped into the cold. Shadow bounded ahead immediately, nose low to the ground, his paws leaving perfect impressions in the powder. Ethan followed, boots crunching softly with each step. The sound echoed across the valley, two sets of tracks carving a thin, fragile path through the silence. The forest swallowed them quickly. The pines loomed tall and heavy with snow, their branches bending under the weight. Light filtered through in soft shards, painting the ground with streaks of silver and blue. Each breath Ethan took sent plumes of vapor drifting upward like smoke. He moved with the steady rhythm of a man who'd done this before, watching the terrain, scanning for patterns, noting wind direction. His senses sharpened, the old marine habits coming alive as naturally as breathing. Only this time, there was no war zone, no enemy. Only a frozen world and the strange certainty that something waited out there. Shadow moved with purpose. He didn't wander or sniff aimlessly. He trotted forward, occasionally pausing to check the air before pressing on in a straight line. His body language was focused, his path deliberate. "Not your first mission, huh?" Ethan said quietly, though the only response was the faint flick of a tail. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, burning weakly through the haze. The terrain grew steeper as they ascended into the denser part of the forest. Ethan's breath grew heavier, fogging the air in bursts. The rifle strap dug into his shoulder, but he didn't slow. Around midday, they reached an old clearing, a forgotten logging trail half swallowed by snow. The remnants of wooden beams and rusted metal hooks jutted from the drifts like bones. Ethan paused, scanning the area. Shadow stopped too, nose twitching. Then he veered off to the left, moving toward a cluster of trees. Ethan followed, and that's when he saw it. A strip of fabric fluttering weakly in the breeze, caught on a low branch. He stepped closer, pulling it free. It was faded plaid, torn cleanly down the middle, not old enough to be relic. Recent. Ethan's heartbeat quickened. He turned the fabric over in his hand, brushing off snow. "You were right," he murmured. "Someone's been here." Shadow gave a soft bark, low and short, before moving ahead again. They followed the trail deeper, their footprints mingling with faint, older impressions half buried by snow. Every so often, Ethan would spot another sign. A dent where a heavy object had rested, the corner of a discarded wrapper, a half-buried thermos glinting faintly beneath ice. He crouched to examine it. The logo had peeled away, but the steel was clean, untarnished. He unscrewed the cap, frozen solid, but inside, a trace of coffee scent remained. Someone had been here within the past few days. Ethan's pulse drummed louder. He looked at Shadow, who waited silently beside him, eyes locked on the forest ahead. "All right," he whispered, rising to his feet. "Lead on." The hours blurred into motion, climbing over fallen logs, crossing frozen creeks, weaving through endless corridors of pine. The quiet was total, broken only by the rhythmic crunch of boots and paws. Somewhere far above, a hawk circled, its shadow gliding briefly over the snow before vanishing into the light. As they moved, Ethan's thoughts drifted inward. He remembered patrols under desert suns, the long marches where every sound meant life or death. Back then, he'd trusted his K9 partner more than he trusted his own instincts. The bond between handler and dog wasn't built in training manuals. It was built in the silence between commands, in the unspoken promise that neither would leave the other behind. He glanced at Shadow. The dog trotted a few yards ahead, shoulders rippling beneath his thick coat. Every so often, he'd glance back to make sure Ethan was following, amber eyes bright against the pale world. Ethan felt something stir, a familiar sense of partnership, purpose. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed it. Guess it's just us again, he murmured. Two ghosts chasing another. The light began to fade. The sky bled into shades of pink and gold, then gray. The cold deepened, biting sharper with every gust. Ethan's legs ached from trudging through snow up to his knees, but Shadow showed no signs of slowing. His pace even quickened as if some invisible thread were pulling him forward. Finally, as the last light of day dipped behind the peaks, Shadow stopped. His entire body stiffened. He lifted his head high, nose twitching in the air. Ethan came up beside him, chest heaving. "What is it?" The shepherd gave a low growl, soft but certain. His gaze was fixed on the valley below. Ethan followed it, squinting through the gathering dusk. For a moment he saw nothing. Just snow, trees, shadow. Then, faintly, almost invisible, a thin column of gray rose from behind a distant ridge. Smoke. Ethan's pulse kicked hard. "Son of a bitch," he breathed. Shadow looked up at him, tail still, eyes gleaming with triumph and urgency. "Yeah," Ethan whispered, his breath fogging the air. "I see it too." He tightened the strap of his pack, slung the rifle over his shoulder, and started down the slope beside his silent guide. The wilderness had offered them no mercy, but it had just given them proof of life. And somewhere beyond that rising smoke, a secret waited. One that would change everything. By the time they reached the valley, the sun was gone. Dusk bled slowly across the mountains, swallowing what little light remained. The snow reflected the dying glow like a sheet of dull silver, and the forest stood in long black rows, silent, breathless, ancient. Ethan's legs burned from the trek. His lungs stung with cold, each breath slicing sharp and shallow. But Shadow didn't slow. The German shepherd pressed forward with quiet urgency, head low, tail stiff, moving with the single-minded focus of a creature, that knew where it was going. They emerged into a clearing, and Ethan stopped dead in his tracks. At the far end of the clearing stood a cabin, small, old, its wood weathered to gray. Smoke drifted from the chimney, rising in thin curls against the fading sky. Yet the snow around it lay untouched. No footprints, no tracks, no sign of anyone moving between the door and the woods. Ethan's instincts screamed. He gripped the rifle tighter, eyes scanning the perimeter. The cabin looked abandoned, yet the smoke told a different story. "Someone's home," he murmured, more to himself than to Shadow. The shepherd's fur bristled. He let out a low growl, not of fear, but warning. Then, without hesitation, he bolted toward the cabin. "Shadow! Wait!" Ethan hissed, trudging after him through knee-deep snow. By the time he reached the porch, Shadow was already at the door, claws raking against the wood. The dog whined, then barked once, a sharp, desperate sound that cut through the still air. Ethan crouched beside him, eyes narrowing as he examined the door. It wasn't locked in any ordinary way. Heavy chains wrapped around the handle and frame, secured with a rusted iron padlock. Whoever lived here hadn't been trying to keep people out. They were keeping someone in. A chill colder than the mountain wind crawled up Ethan's spine. "Easy, boy," he said, placing a steadying hand on Shadow's back. "We'll get it open." The dog didn't stop scratching. His claws tore thin lines into the wood, breath coming in short bursts of steam. He was frantic, urgent in a way Ethan had never seen before. Ethan slung his rifle off his shoulder and gripped it by the barrel. One strong swing, and the butt slammed against the lock with a metallic crack. The old padlock held firm. He hit it again, and again. The sound echoed through the clearing, harsh, hollow, each strike breaking the silence wider. Finally, on the fourth blow, the lock snapped. The chain clattered to the porch in a heavy coil. Ethan took a step back, raising his rifle. He didn't know what he expected, someone armed, a trap, a bear. But nothing could have prepared him for the smell that seeped from the cabin as the door swung inward. The air inside was heavy, thick with rot and sickness, the kind of stench that told stories of neglect, of time, of pain. Jesus, Ethan muttered, covering his mouth with his sleeve. Shadow darted in first, tail low, body tense. Ethan followed, the barrel of his rifle leading the way. The cabin was dark except for the faint glow of embers dying in a stove at the far wall. At first, he saw nothing but shadows. Then his eyes adjusted, and his breath caught. A small cot sat against the back wall. On it lay a woman, frail, motionless, her wrists chained to the headboard. Her skin was pale, lips cracked, hair tangled and matted against the pillow. She looked half alive, half ghost. Shadow reached her first. He jumped onto the bed with surprising gentleness, pressing his nose to her hand. A small, broken sound left his throat, half whine, half sob. The woman stirred faintly. Her fingers twitched. Her eyelids fluttered open just enough to reveal eyes that were clouded but not empty. Her lips moved. A single whisper escaped, hoarse and trembling. Rex. The name froze Ethan where he stood. Not Rex. But it didn't matter. The sound of it hit him like a physical blow. Shadow licked the woman's fingers, whimpering softly. The noise carried more emotion than any human cry could. It wasn't confusion or fear. It was recognition. Reunion. Ethan lowered his rifle slowly. His chest tightened as understanding began to take shape, piece by piece. The dog hadn't been lost. He hadn't been running from something. He'd been running to something. Dear God, Ethan whispered. You came back for her. He crossed the room, careful not to startle the woman. Her breath came in shallow rasps. Her skin was cold, her pulse weak beneath the dirt-streaked veins. He dropped to one knee beside her bed and checked the restraints, old, rusted metal chains cutting into her skin. Hey, he said softly. Ma'am, can you hear me? Her eyes flicked toward him, dazed, unfocused. She tried to speak again, but no sound came. It's okay, he said. We're gonna get you. Out! He pried at the first shackle until the chain gave way with a brittle snap. The woman's arm fell limply to her side. He unfastened the other, his hands trembling. The whole time Shadow stayed close, licking her wrist, whining quietly, as if trying to will her back to consciousness. When both hands were free, Ethan grabbed a blanket from a nearby chair, filthy, but better than nothing, and wrapped it gently around her shoulders. Her body was light, almost weightless, like lifting a child. He carried her toward the stove and lowered her onto a rug near the warmth. Hang in there, he muttered, feeding the embers until flames crackled again. Shadow lay beside her, pressing his body close, sharing what heat he could. Ethan crouched nearby, watching as color slowly began to return to her face. Her breathing steadied, faint but present. He exhaled, the tension draining from his shoulders. For a long moment, no one moved. The fire popped, throwing flickers of gold across the cabin walls. Outside, the wind had gone still, as though the mountain itself was holding its breath. Then Ethan looked at the dog again, at the way Shadow's head rested gently on the woman's lap, his eyes half closed, his expression soft and full of something Ethan hadn't seen in years. Loyalty. Love. Damn, Ethan whispered, shaking his head. You really did it, didn't you? You found her. Shadow lifted his gaze to meet Ethan's. No sound came, but in that silence, everything was said. The war, the storms, the endless nights, they had all led to this moment. And for the first time since he'd come to these mountains, Ethan Cole felt something shift inside him. It wasn't peace. Not yet. But it was close. He looked at the frail woman by the fire, at the dog that refused to leave her side, and felt a truth as clear as the frozen air outside. This animal hadn't wandered into his life by chance. He'd brought Ethan here for a reason, and whatever that reason was, it had only just begun to reveal itself. The cabin was quiet, except for the low crackle of the fire. Outside, the wind had died, and with it, the world seemed to hold its breath. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood, smoke, and something faintly metallic, the residue of rusted chains that still lay twisted near the bed. Ethan knelt beside the woman, his rough hands trembling as he tucked the worn blanket more tightly around her frail shoulders. Her breathing was shallow, fragile, but steady. Every rise and fall of her chest felt like a small miracle. The German shepherd lay pressed against her, head resting on her lap. His golden eyes reflected the firelight, flickering like twin embers. Every so often, he let out a soft whine and nudged her arm with his nose, as if reminding himself she was still there. Ethan had already done what he could. Wrapped her in warmth, fed the fire, checked for wounds. But beyond that, all he could do was wait. He studied her face, under the glow. The lines etched deep into her skin spoke of years spent under the weight of something heavier than age. Her hair, a tangle of silver and white, was streaked with dirt. Yet even in that frailty, there was a quiet dignity, a strength that had endured far too much. He found his voice only after a long silence. "Ma'am," he said softly, "can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered. For a moment he thought she might be slipping away. Then, faintly, her lips parted. "Margaret," she rasped, the name barely audible. Ethan leaned closer. "Margaret." She nodded weakly. "Margaret Hale." Her voice was the brittle whisper of someone whose words had been starved along with her body. "You're safe now, Margaret," Ethan said. "No one's going to hurt you again." At the sound of his tone, firm, gentle, certain, the woman's eyes filled with tears she was too weak to shed. Her hand twitched, reaching blindly toward the dog. Shadow pressed closer, his tail thumping once against the floorboards. It was then that Ethan noticed the small leather-bound book lying half-hidden beneath the cot. Its cover was cracked and warped with moisture, the edges frayed. Something about it felt deliberate, placed there, not dropped. He picked it up carefully, brushing off a layer of dust and grime. The first page was scrawled in looping, faded handwriting. September 12th. He squinted in the dim light, reading aloud under his breath. "My nephew Caleb came again today. He said we were going on a trip. I didn't understand until he brought me here." The next few lines trembled across the page. "He told me I was too old to manage the land now, that I should sign over the deed. I told him no, he locked the door." Ethan turned the page. His pulse quickened. Each entry that followed sank deeper into darkness. The slow unraveling of a life turned into captivity. Margaret wrote of days without food, nights filled with cold, and the way Caleb's visits became less about persuasion and more about punishment. "He took the firewood away last week, said I should think faster. The snow is coming. He laughs when I ask for blankets." The letters grew shakier, the ink sometimes blurred by what could only be tears. Then came an entry dated only a few weeks ago. "Shadow tried to protect me. He wouldn't let Caleb near me. He barked until his voice went raw. Caleb beat him with the rifle stock. Then he dragged him outside. I heard the gunshot. I screamed until my voice broke. He said the mutt wouldn't bother us again. Ethan's throat tightened. His fingers gripped the edge of the page until his knuckles turned white. He looked over at the dog. Shadow hadn't moved, but his ears had tilted slightly, as if he knew, as if the memory still echoed in his bones. Ethan's heart ached at the image that rose in his mind. A loyal dog broken and left in the snow, bleeding and alone. But that wasn't the end of the story. He turned another page and the handwriting shifted, weaker now, trembling, but still defiant. I prayed he was wrong, that Shadow wasn't gone. I dreamed of him last night, running through snow heading for the cabin near the ridge. Maybe dreams are only wishes, but maybe there's something more. Ethan could barely breathe. He glanced toward the door, imagining it now. The endless white, the bitter cold, the blinding storm. A wounded animal crawling through it, step by step, guided by nothing but instinct and love. He saw it all in his mind, Shadow dragging himself across the frozen ground, leaving a trail of blood that vanished under the snow. His breath coming in ragged bursts, vision fading, every muscle screaming to give up. And yet he pressed on. The forest, the wind, the night itself had become his enemy. But he never stopped. Not until he found the cabin. Not until he found Ethan. Ethan shut the diary, pressing it against his chest, as if to keep his own heart from breaking. The fire popped loudly, startling him back to the present. Margaret stirred at the sound, her eyelids fluttering again. He crouched beside her. It's all right. You rest, okay? You did good. You held on. Her voice came out as a whisper barely louder than the fire's crackle. He'll come back. Not tonight, Ethan said firmly. Not ever again if I can help it. She tried to shake her head, but lacked the strength. A single tear slipped down her temple. Shadow, she murmured. He came back. I knew he would. Ethan swallowed hard. He looked at the dog again. The loyal soldier lying close, eyes half shut, chest rising and falling with steady breaths. For the first time since the war, Ethan felt something beyond pain. It was awe. Pure, humbling awe. He placed a hand on Shadow's head. The fur was warm under his palm, soft and real. You didn't come to survive, did you? Ethan whispered, his voice breaking. You came to finish a mission. Shadow blinked slowly, his gaze calm and unflinching. Outside, the fire's glow flickered across the snow, casting long shadows through the cracks in the walls. Inside, man, dog, and survivor sat in the quiet aftermath of revelation, a triangle bound not by fate, but by choice. Ethan leaned back, staring into the flames, and felt the first sting of tears he didn't bother to hide. For the first time in years, he understood what courage truly meant. It wasn't standing tall on the battlefield. It was crawling through hell on 4 legs, with nothing but love to guide the way. The mountain night had turned black and bone-cold. Only the faint flicker of firelight escaped through the cracks in the cabin walls, painting thin gold scars against the snow. Inside, Margaret slept near the hearth, bundled in Ethan's coat, her breathing shallow but even. Ethan sat on the floor beside her, rifle across his knees. His eyes burned from fatigue, but his body refused to rest. Every sound, the creak of timber, the hiss of wind through the chimney, kept him taut as a drawn wire. Shadow lay near the door, head on his paws, but not asleep. His ears twitched at every gust, every shift in the wind. The dog's body was a coiled spring, half resting, half waiting. Ethan's gaze drifted toward the diary on the table. Margaret's trembling words still echoed in his mind. The name Caleb struck like a nail each time he thought it. A nephew who chained his own blood, who beat a loyal dog nearly to death, all for greed. And somewhere out there, Ethan knew that man was still breathing. He checked the rifle's chamber again out of habit. Loaded. Ready. The fire popped, scattering embers. Margaret murmured in her sleep, her lips forming a name Ethan couldn't make out. He leaned forward, listening. Then Shadow's head snapped up. A low growl rumbled through his chest, deep and primal. His fur bristled along the ridge of his spine. Ethan froze. "What is it, boy?" The dog didn't answer, only rose slowly to his feet, tail stiff, eyes locked on the door. The growl deepened, vibrating through the floorboards. Then Ethan heard it too, a sound that didn't belong in the silence of the mountains. Footsteps, slow, crunching in the snow, heavy. Ethan's pulse began to hammer. He stood, rifle raised, heart pounding in time with the rhythm of the approaching steps. Through the slit in the shutters, he caught a shadow moving, tall, broad, carrying something in one hand, a lantern, and a gun. The door handle rattled once, then again. "Margaret!" a voice called, muffled through the wood. "You awake, Auntie?" The words were slick with mockery. Shadow bared his teeth, a low snarl spilling from his throat. Ethan stepped back from the fire, positioning himself between the bed and the door. The voice came again, sharper now. "You locked the damn door? Who's in there with you?" Ethan's hand tightened on the rifle. The latch turned, but the door held. Then came a hard kick. The wood groaned under the impact. Another kick, louder this time. The hinges shrieked. "Stay down," Ethan whispered to Margaret, though she was barely conscious. The next blow sent the door flying open. Cold air and snow burst inside. Caleb stumbled through the doorway, the lantern swinging wildly in his hand. His eyes darted from the woman by the fire to the stranger standing before him with a rifle leveled at his chest. "What the hell?" He didn't finish. Shadow lunged. The dog's snarl was thunder in the small room. He hit Caleb mid-step, knocking him backward into the table. The lantern clattered to the floor, but didn't break. Caleb screamed, swinging the pistol wildly, but Ethan was already there. He slammed the rifle stock against the man's wrist, sending the weapon flying. It hit the wall with a dull thud. Caleb stumbled, snarling, and drove his elbow into Ethan's ribs. Pain flared sharp, but Ethan didn't let go. He drove his shoulder into Caleb's chest, pinning him against the wall. "You're done," Ethan growled. Caleb spat blood, eyes wild. "You don't know who you're—" The lantern fell. It hit the floor and shattered this time. Kerosene splashed across the boards, the liquid catching fire instantly. Flames leapt up in a serpentine rush, racing across the wood. "Damn it!" Ethan cursed, shoving Caleb aside. The heat bloomed fast, roaring with oxygen as it fed on dry timber. The fire spread like a living thing, crawling up the walls, licking the curtains, devouring the old cabin with a feral hunger. Margaret stirred, coughing violently. "Ethan!" He turned, sprinting toward her as smoke began to choke the air. "I've got you!" He wrapped his arms around her frail frame, lifting her as easily as a child. She gasped, her hands gripping his sleeve weakly. Behind them, Caleb scrambled to his feet, eyes wide with terror as the flames rose. "You'll kill us all!" he shouted, stumbling toward the door. Shadow blocked his path, teeth flashing. The dog barked once, sharp, commanding. Caleb froze, then bolted sideways, crashing through the table to escape. Ethan didn't look back. He could feel the heat clawing at his back, could hear the roar of the fire swallowing everything. The roof creaked above them, a terrible cracking sound that promised collapse. "Shadow!" Ethan shouted, coughing through the smoke. "Come on!" The dog darted toward them, barking through the haze. The air was thick, suffocating. Ethan's eyes burned. He moved by instinct, one arm shielding Margaret's face, the other feeling his way toward the door. The world had become a storm of orange and black. Sparks rained like fiery snow. Shadow's bark guided him, 3 short bursts, 1 long, the same rhythm as a military call signal. Ethan followed it blindly, trusting it like he once trusted gunfire maps in combat. Then, the cold. They burst out into the night. Ethan stumbled through the snow, falling to his knees. The freezing air hit him like a shockwave. He laid Margaret down gently, pulling his coat tighter around her trembling body. Behind them, the cabin was an inferno. Flames tore through the roof, consuming beams and walls alike. The sky glowed orange, smoke curling upward in thick plumes that vanished into the stars. Caleb stumbled from the side, coughing, half-blind, and collapsed face first in the snow. Ethan spared him no glance. His world had narrowed to the woman gasping for air and the dog standing sentinel beside her. Shadow circled once before lying down next to Margaret, pressing his flank against her for warmth. His fur was singed in patches, his chest heaving, but his eyes never left her face. Ethan fell beside them, choking back a cough that turned into something else entirely. A sob. His tears froze the moment they left his skin. The fire roared behind them, a monster devouring its own heart. The heat shimmered in the icy air, casting shadows that danced over their faces. He looked at the dog, so still, so steady, and whispered, voice raw, "You saved her. You saved us all." Shadow didn't move, only pressed closer to the woman, his breath visible in the cold, shallow, but determined. Ethan reached out, resting a trembling hand on the dog's head. The fur was hot from the fire and wet from melting snow. In the reflection of the flames, he saw the truth as clear as daylight. This wasn't just a rescue. It was redemption. For the dog, for the woman, and maybe, just maybe, for himself. The blaze crackled and wailed, a requiem for everything that had been lost. Ethan looked once more at the burning cabin, the chains, the diary, the ghosts, all of it turning to ash. And then, with his heart breaking open against the frozen earth, he whispered, "It's over now." But as he watched Shadow lying protectively beside the unconscious woman, the snow swirling softly around them, he knew it wasn't over. Not yet. It had only just begun. Dawn crept slowly over the ridges, painting the snow in shades of gold and pale rose. The storm had long passed, but its scars still lingered. A charred skeleton where the cabin once stood, smoke curling from the wreckage like the last breath of something ancient. Ethan Cole sat in the snow, his body aching, his lungs raw from smoke and cold. He had laid Margaret a few feet from the fire's dying light, wrapping her in the thick wool of his own coat. Her skin was ghost pale, her lips cracked, but the pulse in her neck still fluttered, faint, stubborn, alive. Beside her, Shadow lay half buried in snow, his chest rising and falling in slow, heavy rhythm. His fur was singed in places. A patch near his shoulder blackened where sparks had caught. But he was alive. Barely. Ethan had stayed awake through the long hours of night, feeding small fires, checking their breaths, refusing to let the darkness claim either of them. Now, as the light of morning broke over the peaks, he felt the weight of exhaustion settle deep into his bones. His hands trembled when he tried to rub warmth back into Margaret's fingers. He had seen men die in war, strong, loud, fearless men, but something about watching this woman fight for every breath in the frozen dawn felt heavier than any battlefield. "Hold on, Margaret," he murmured. You made it this far. Don't you give up on me now. Her eyelids fluttered. A small sound escaped her lips, something between a sigh and a whisper. Ethan leaned closer, but her words were lost to the wind. He reached down to tuck the coat tighter around her shoulders, and that's when he felt it. Something stiff and solid, hidden in the lining. At first he thought it was debris, maybe a stick or a folded tool. But when his fingers brushed fabric instead of metal, a strange curiosity gripped him. Carefully, he opened the inner seam and drew out a small bundle wrapped in oilskin, sealed tight, with old twine. The material was worn, brittle with age. Ethan held it up to the light. There were markings beneath the dirt, the faint imprint of letters once pressed into leather. He untied the knot, his breath clouding in the cold air. Inside lay several yellowed papers, folded neatly, edges crumbling like dried leaves. The top one bore an official seal, faded but unmistakable. Gallatin County Land Deed, 1972. He turned the page over, tracing the ink with his thumb. Owner, Margaret Hale. Beneath it, another name. His hand froze. His pulse stuttered. Daniel Cole. For a moment the world seemed to tilt. The cold, the fire, even the sounds of the forest, all of it blurred into nothing. Daniel Cole. His grandfather. Ethan stared at the signature, his eyes burning. The familiar looping D and sharp slant of the C, exactly as he remembered from the old letters that used to sit framed on his father's desk. He'd grown up hearing stories about Daniel, the park ranger who built their family's cabin, the man who'd lived and died in those very mountains. But there had been whispers, too. A woman he loved and lost, a tragedy no one spoke of. And now, that woman was lying unconscious at his feet. His throat went dry. He turned toward her, his voice barely more than a rasp. Margaret, he said. Margaret Hale. Do you know this name? Daniel Cole? For a moment, there was no response. Then her eyelids flickered open. Her gaze, unfocused and feverish, shifted toward him. Daniel, she whispered, the word trembling like it had waited half a lifetime to be spoken. Ethan felt a cold rush flood his veins. You knew him. A faint, fragile smile ghosted across her lips. Knew him? Her voice was raw, cracked with age and memory. He was my heart, before the war took him away. Her breath caught, the corners of her eyes glistening. He wrote me once, said he'd come back. But his family, she trailed off, lost in some distant grief. They said I'd ruined him, that I wasn't good enough. I left. Thought I'd be saving him pain. I never knew. Ethan felt something inside him fracture. The sharp, quiet breaking of an old wall he hadn't even known was still standing. He knelt closer, his voice trembling. He was my grandfather, Margaret. Daniel Cole was my grandfather. The realization hung between them, fragile and enormous, like dawn breaking after a long, unending night. Margaret's breath hitched. Her hand, weak but certain, lifted from the blanket. She touched his face, fingers tracing the outline of his jaw, as if searching for something familiar. I see him, she whispered. In your eyes. The same kindness. The same sorrow. Ethan's vision blurred. He swallowed hard, the taste of salt and smoke heavy in his mouth. She smiled faintly. Then he did find peace. Through you. He couldn't speak. For years, Ethan Cole had believed his bloodline was cursed, a chain of men who carried more silence than love, more ghosts than laughter. But kneeling beside this woman, he finally understood. The silence wasn't punishment. It was a wound passed down, waiting for someone to stop running from it. That someone was him. Shadow stirred weakly in the snow, his breath thin and misty. Ethan met the dog's weary amber eyes, mirrors of pain, exhaustion, understanding. "You knew," Ethan whispered. "You didn't just save her. You brought her home." Shadow blinked once, resting his head beside Margaret's still hand. Ethan looked between them, the wounded soldier, the fading woman, and himself, the broken man who had stumbled into their story. Tears came freely for the first time since the war. Grief for his grandfather, his fallen brothers, the ghosts that haunted every night. But beneath it all pulsed something purer, relief. "You brought her home," he breathed. "You brought me home." The morning sun climbed higher, melting frost into light. Smoke from the cabin rose thinly into the sky like a spirit set free. Ethan stayed there, hand on Shadow's head, Margaret's frail fingers clutching his sleeve. In that stillness, 3 survivors breathed as one, man, woman, and dog, bound by blood, love, and the stubborn endurance of the heart. For the first time in years, Ethan Cole believed some stories didn't end in ashes. Some were carried home. Spring came to the Montana mountains like forgiveness. Snow melted into silver streams. Grass returned in shy green patches. The sharp air softened with pine and thawing earth. In the clearing stood a rebuilt cabin, new wood but the same soul. Where ruins had once scarred the land, wildflowers now rose defiantly from the ash. Ethan stood on the porch one morning, hands in his pockets, listening to life hum around him. Birds darted through the trees. Wind whispered in the pines. Behind him came the sound of Margaret's laughter, a sound he cherished like breath. 3 months had passed since that night of fire and fury. Caleb sat behind bars in Gallatin County Jail. Margaret, though fragile, had recovered with the season, color returning to her cheeks, light to her eyes. Sometimes Ethan caught her gazing toward the forest, as if speaking to ghosts only she could see. Shadow had healed too. The burns along his flank had become medals, a story written into his fur. He no longer limped, though he moved slower now, burdened by memory. Ethan thought maybe they all did. Margaret refused to leave the mountains. "It's my home," she'd said, "and now it's yours too." So they stayed. Together, they rebuilt. Together, they began again. Mornings rang with hammers and saws, the scent of pine thick in the air. Evenings they sat by the new hearth, sharing stories softened by time. Ethan spoke of the war. Margaret told him of Daniel Cole, the young ranger who'd once carved their initials into an oak by the river. They never found that tree, but they found its place. The clearing had become their sanctuary, a symbol of what had been lost and what had come home. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the sheriff. Inside was the legal deed to the property, Margaret Hale and Daniel Cole, and below them, a new name, Ethan Cole. Ethan traced the words. "We're keeping it," he said quietly. Margaret smiled. "It was meant to stay in your family." "Not just for us," Ethan replied. "For what it can stand for." That was the beginning of the Cole Foundation, a small, hopeful thing born from tragedy and love. With help from the sheriff and Ethan's old service contacts, they created a trust to fund causes close to their hearts, animal rescues and veteran recovery. "Two kinds of soldiers," Margaret said when they signed the papers. "The ones who fight wars, and the ones who never stop fighting to love again." Within months, the first donations went out to a canine rehabilitation center in Bozeman and a veterans outreach program in Missoula. Ethan delivered them himself. The story of the German Shepherd who had crossed a blizzard to save a life, had already spread. People called Shadow the dog who remembered. By late April, the mountains were alive again. Streams laughed down the slopes, wildflowers painted the meadows, and the cabin stood strong, a promise kept. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned amber, Ethan sat on the porch with a mug of coffee. Shadow lay beside him, head on his boot, breathing slow and steady. The soldier inside Ethan lingered, but the silence had changed. It no longer punished. It healed. Behind him, the screen door creaked. Margaret stepped out, shawl around her shoulders, eyes catching the sunset. "Beautiful evening," she said. "Yeah," Ethan murmured. "Hard to believe this place was ashes not long ago." Margaret smiled faintly. "Ashes make the soil richer. Life always finds its way back." They sat in quiet companionship, the world humming softly around them. Shadow stirred, lifting his head toward the horizon. "He's different now," Margaret said. "Calmer, like Daniel when he came home from the service. At peace with his ghosts." Ethan nodded, stroking the shepherd's fur. "He earned it." Margaret looked toward the dark pines. "Some bonds never die, Ethan. They just wait for us to find them again." Ethan's throat tightened. He followed her gaze to the tree line, where the dog had once howled into the storm. He could almost see it all again. The trail in the snow, the smoke, the locked door. Everything that had led them here. He touched Shadow's shoulder gently. "Thank you, soldier," he whispered. The dog lifted his head, amber eyes catching the last light. For a moment, Ethan saw Rex, his fallen partner, alive again in that gaze. Then Shadow blinked, and it was just him. Loyal, scarred, eternal. The breeze carried pine and melting snow. Margaret rocked slowly, humming a tune Ethan didn't know. The world was quiet, but no longer empty. In that silence, Ethan finally understood peace. It wasn't the absence of pain. It was the sound of two lives rebuilding, and a dog breathing softly at his feet. As the sun slipped behind the mountains, painting a ribbon of gold across the sky, Ethan closed his eyes and let it wash over him. The ghosts remained, but they no longer haunted. They watched, content, perhaps. And for the first time, Ethan Cole didn't feel alone. He was home. Sometimes, stories like Ethan's and Shadow's remind us that love doesn't always speak in words. Sometimes it walks beside us on four legs, quietly mending what we thought was beyond repair. German shepherds have that gift. They don't just protect us. They find us, in our loneliness, in our silence, and somehow lead us back to life again. If you've ever looked into your dog's eyes and felt that unspoken bond, you already know what I mean. They ask for so little, yet give us everything. Loyalty, forgiveness, and the kind of love that never wavers. If you'd like to understand your own dog even more deeply, I found a wonderful resource that really helped me reconnect with mine. I'll leave the link below. No pressure. Just something I thought you might enjoy exploring in your own time. At the end of the day, all they really want is our time, our patience, and our love. And when we give them that, they give us something even greater in return: home.